So today we kind of already did some sculpting, right? Kind of on the ability to use your crease brush, right, to kind of push around some shape. I still want to do a little more creasing, right? So I still have my crease brush on. And what I can easily come in here and do is, like we said before, is, remember, left and right bracket can control the size of your brush. What I can do is I can come in here and I can just use this crease brush to kind of define muscle tone a little bit, to define creases and wrinkles. Remember, I have the preference on, right? Edit preferences. Navigation, I've got that orbit around selection on, right? It's a checkbox right here. And that's cool because wherever you're sculpting or painting or even just selecting in regular modeling or even where you last tweaked with your tweak tool, it'll actually set that as kind of your orbit. And it's kind of a neat way to kind of automatically focus on where you're working in Blender, and it's really neat. A lot of packages don't quite have that. ZBrush does, which is kind of neat. So they kind of basically stole that from ZBrush and just kind of universally applied it over the whole software. But we see we can come in here and we can do some cool extra little crease work, right? So I can just left click drag to kind of crease some shapes and forms. Remember Shift, if you hold down Shift, that'll automatically do your smoothing, right? That's this brush right here, right? That very top kind of red brush. It's called Smooth. Shift automatically smooths, right? And that kind of has that effect of de-wrinkling or softening your shape, right? So remember, these are some cool features and functions you have to this mesh. Now, I feel like I could use a little more geometry for what I'm about to show you. So remember, your blue wrench is your modifiers. And the modifier we currently have applied is that multi-res, right? That's our sculpting one. So I'm going to subdivide that one more time. You basically subdivide as much as your computer can handle, right? So I've got it at level 5, about 1.5 million. Not sure, worked pretty well for what I'm going to show you today. Now, some of the other things, we kind of talked about this the other day also, some strokes, right? We started talking about your stroke features. In this case, I'm going to go to the draw sharp, right? There's draw at the very top, draw sharp right below that, but then there's also that crease, right? So we're going to go to draw sharp. And remember, there is this menu called stroke, right? There is this menu called stroke. Now, the thing with stroke is you'll see there's several options. We'll talk about drag dot next week when we're kind of doing some stuff for the like little rivets and buttons for the gear itself. But you'll see there's something called line, right? Line, right here. So if we go to stroke method, stroke, and we go to the stroke method at the top, we can pick line. And remember what that does, and I'll make my brush size a little smaller, right? Left bracket makes it smaller, right bracket makes it bigger. This actually will apply a line stroke to your brush. So you see if I left click drag, it gives me a line, and this could be a great easy way to kind of make this kind of detailing. I'm going to undo a little bit. Remember, Control Z is undo, because I actually want the strength for that brush up higher. You see with line and a bit of extra subdivision, right, you can get that extra detail here. So you see a line kind of drags it out just as a line. It kind of goes straight, right, like a line would be. But also, you'll notice it just kind of goes the length, right? Wherever it starts, that's where it starts sculpting. Wherever it ends, that's where it ends. So doing something like this can be really, really easy with your line stroke. So this is one of those things where I wanted to start to show you that there's more than just the default brushes. You can actually modify the way they behave with your different strokes. Space is the default, and that's kind of the normal just sculpt, right? But line actually constrains this to a line from the start of it to the end of it, and it makes it straight. So this is really, really cool, and this could be a great way to kind of do details like this. So it's one of the things I wanted to get you guys to see was the line stroke, and that there's some cool strokes in here, all right? And so we can do some neat stuff alone just with that, right? So line stroke. Now the thing though is there's other strokes, right? We can go back to space, which is our default. I'm going to go back to the draw brush because I want to show you guys how to use textures now to do sculpting, right? I want to show you guys how to use textures for sculpting. So how do you use a texture? Well, one of the things is you want to actually load the texture in. So remember, in the Properties menu, right here, right, we have the kind of reddish salmon color. It's kind of slightly salmon, but it's more reddish. But it's kind of like not quite like normal red. It's got like a slight salmon tint to it, right? But at the very bottom, there's one that looks like a checkerboard, right? Like for a chess, right? If you click on that, this is where you could load in textures, right? So what I could do is I could go to New, right? Because when we click on this, it brings it right up here, right? You see there's kind of some options there, brush, brush mask. I'm going to click on New. When I click on New, it brings this up, right? And there's lots of other things we'll talk about with this later on, but really when we click on New, it brings this up. Remember, it's just kind of the little reddish salmon colored checkerboard at the bottom. And in this case, I've already got textures. Now, how do you get textures? Well, you can actually take a picture with your phone, and you can just download it onto your computer, right? Whichever way you want to download it, right? You can go to places like textures.com, sign up for a free account, and get some royalty-free textures there. Of course, you can just Google search. With Google search, though, you have to be careful of copyrights, right? That somebody hasn't copyrighted or watermarked the texture. You're not supposed to use those for your work if they are. So in this case, I'm just going to hit Open because I've already got some ones that I've downloaded, so I'll hit Open. And what it does is it brings up a browser, right? And I can just go to the Textures folder. And what I could do is I could load in a texture. Now, for what I'm about to do, I'm not really going to use a normal image. It's better to use what we call kind of alphas, right? Usually an alpha texture is black and white and gray, and you can kind of see it's more like a pattern with a lot of black around the edges so that it won't sculpt. In fact, the black won't sculpt at all or paint color at all, right? It's kind of like it's kind of like when you create a stencil for painting on something, right? You kind of cut out a shape in paper or cardboard, you tape it on there, and then the hole is where you can paint, and then the cardboard, you know, that'll catch the other paint. Similar here, right? Black won't paint or sculpt at all. Any gray value will a little bit, and white will paint like fully or sculpt fully. I'm going to select that one. Open image. And now we see that this is available, right? It's been loaded into Blender. So now what we could do is we could go to texture, right? So stroke was kind of the thing we were talking about earlier with line. Now I can go to texture, and you'll see that I can get rid of it here if I want to, although it turns it off. It doesn't actually get rid of it out of Blender. But you'll notice that there's this kind of little pull down, right? There's kind of this menu at the top when you click on texture. I can click on that. You see there it is. Now if I hit X, that turns it off. But if I go back to kind of like that empty checkerboard here, it's like a black and white checkerboard, you'll see it's still there. So even when you hit that X, it's not deleting the texture out of Blender. It's just kind of turning it off in this texture menu. Now by default, I've got the mapping set to tiled. If you want to, and you might find you like it a little better, switch to view plane, right? And what view plane will do with this texture that's been applied to draw is it'll let you just paint it right on the mesh. What it does is it keeps stamping instances of it. So you see if I left click drag, you see how it's just kind of painting that over and over? Basically it's like paint, 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 paint. So it's kind of keep painting it. So view plane can be really cool for doing those kinds of things where you just want to kind of paint that again and again. So you have to think of it like it's stamping it, and then it's stamping it again, and then it's placing it again, it's placing it again, it's placing it again. But almost on top of each other, so you're really just kind of painting kind of a rough kind of noise pattern. But that's one of the neat things you could do with just view plane alone as your mapping option. Now here's the thing is this texture and these mapping can also work with your different strokes. So what I can go in here is I can go to stroke again, and I could pick anchored, right? So space is kind of our default, and that's a good default to usually have on. Line gave us the line feature, which we used for those. And we'll see that there is actually something called anchored. Anchored. And if we turn that on, what's cool about that is wherever you left click drag, that's where it's going to place this image. And by dragging left to right, it changes the size. By dragging it up and down, it rotates it. So texture is still the same texture. View plane mapping is still the same. In fact, for me, I usually use view plane and stencil, right? I usually just use view plane and stencil. But we can modify those with our strokes also. In this case, I want anchored, right? Anchored. And you'll see if I use anchored here, I can left-click drag, and you'll notice that wherever I clicked, that's where it puts the center of the image. And then if I drag left or right, it makes it bigger or smaller. And if I drag up or down, it rotates it. And so this can also be a really cool way to lay texture on. But you see how you can kind of vary it up, right? This will be large, that'll be small. So you can kind of vary the size, the angle. So believe it or not, a lot of these functions are available to allow you to do some really neat stuff. But what we're doing is we're sculpting with a texture. Now, of course, Shift works with this. So if I want, I can go in here to Shift to soften some areas. Right? If I want to kind of blend a little bit here, I can. Or soften. So Shift will still work even with these. But you notice here that you can load a texture in. Right here. You can make sure to apply the texture and tell which kind of mapping type you want. View plane basically just bases it on the camera view. And then just lets it repeat. And then stroke can do line, it can do space, and it can also do anchored. And anchored is this cool one where you can just kind of drag and drop one instance of it. And depending on how much you drag to left or right, it makes it bigger, right? Or smaller. But you can also drag up and down to rotate it. And that can allow you to do some neat sculpting as well. All right, so I feel like that's going to be a great place to stop with that video. Yeah.